There is a secret about history, not the kind written in books, but the kind buried in the foundation of the world you inhabit. A secret that, once heard, cannot be unheard. It concerns the moments where the structures of power were most vulnerable, where a single, unanswerable question could have fractured an entire reality. We are not talking about forgotten battles or lost treasures. We are talking about the deliberate, systematic suppression of human potential, and the extraordinary event in Charleston, South Carolina, on March 4, 1844, when that suppression was briefly exposed. 6 academics, 8 men who believed themselves to be the intellectual crown of the South, masters of logic, philosophy, and science, met in a private room on Meeting Street. The subject was not a rival scholar or a foreign diplomat. It was a 27-year-old enslaved man named Daniel. Their official records of the meeting vanished within weeks. Every written account was purged from college archives, and Daniel himself was erased from plantation ledgers as if he were a ghost. Think about that for a moment. What question, what single concept, could be so toxic to an established order that 6 educated men would conspire to execute a historical and archival assassination? The very existence of that meeting challenges the foundational myth of antebellum America, the myth that the enslaved lacked the mental architecture for higher thought. Charleston in 1844 was not just a city, it was an intellectual fortress, home to the College of Charleston, where the philosophical justification for human bondage was meticulously constructed and defended by scholars trained in the finest European universities. They published treatises on moral philosophy, natural law, and cranial measurements, all designed to prove that the hierarchy was not merely economic, but natural, divine, and scientific. They built a cathedral of lies, and Daniel King, the man they had classified as property, devoid of abstract reasoning, had, through a life lived in secret, acquired the tools to dismantle it. His knowledge was a weapon. His questions were demolition charges. This story is not about slavery, it is about the fundamental, eternal battle between suppressed truth and institutionalized power. It is about how far the elite will go to protect a certainty that underpins their entire reality. They were not merely debating a man, they were defending the very principle of their unquestioned authority. The questions Daniel posed that day were so devastating because they struck at the core contradictions, the claim to Christian morality paired with brutal exploitation, the embrace of Enlightenment reason paired with the denial of basic human intellect, and the use of science to justify a system designed purely for profit. Word count check for Section 1. The spoken text above is approximately 400 words. Colonel Marcus Gadsden's plantation on the Ashley River was a model of calculated cruelty, managed with military precision. 300 acres of rice fields, 47 souls classified as chattel, all operating under the illusion of order and natural submission. But beneath the surface, within the enslaved community, a parallel civilization of knowledge was maintained. Information was not written, it was memorized, woven into songs, hidden in coded conversations, and passed through whispered fragments of forbidden literacy. The law forbade teaching an enslaved person to read, recognizing implicitly that a literate mind is an ungovernable mind. The slave codes were not just about control of the body, they were about the absolute incarceration of the mind. Daniel arrived at the Gadsden estate at the age of 12, a product of an estate settlement. He was listed in the records for $400, with a notation for aptitude for house service, a chilling term that meant proximity to the master's world, and therefore, proximity to the master's knowledge. His true education, the one that terrified the system, had begun earlier. His previous owner, Dr. Ambrose Fletcher, a forgetful, aging physician in Virginia, had unknowingly given Daniel the key to his own prison. Dr. Fletcher kept an extensive library, and Daniel's mother was tasked with cleaning his study. While cleaning, young Daniel discovered the silent, revolutionary power of books. The doctor, in his loneliness and absent-mindedness, had a habit of reading aloud difficult Latin, mathematical proofs, philosophical texts. He never acknowledged Daniel's presence, yet Daniel, standing silently in the corner, absorbed everything. He was a human storage bank, memorizing pages, definitions, and concepts he couldn't yet fully understand, storing invisible wealth for a time he couldn't yet imagine. The system assumes the mind you are born into is the mind you will die with. It assumes a fixed capacity dictated by social class or, in this horrific context, by race. Daniel's life was a walking, breathing contradiction to that premise. His mind was a sponge, soaking up the logic of Epictetus, the precision of Euclidean geometry, and the structure of Latin grammar, all assembled without a teacher, built from scraps and patterns. Dr. Fletcher once read aloud the words of Epictetus, "No man is free who is not master of himself." He looked directly at Daniel, then 9 years old, and asked, "I wonder what you make of that, boy?" He didn't wait for an answer. But the question itself, the acknowledgement that Daniel might make something of it, was the first crack in the wall. The journey to Charleston was a trauma, a force severing from everything familiar, but Daniel carried the library with him, a secret archive inside his own skull. The military efficiency of Colonel Gadsden's plantation was designed to crush the spirit, but Daniel used the house as a vantage point, becoming an expert in the performance of ignorance, a blank slate behind which a revolutionary consciousness was rapidly expanding. Word count check for Section 2. The spoken text above is approximately 400 words. By the age of 14, Daniel possessed a mastery of languages and abstract thought that would have shamed many of the College of Charleston's graduates. He could navigate English, Latin, and some Greek, having taught himself by deciphering grammar rules from context, assembling understanding through raw pattern recognition. It was a feat of sheer intellectual will, like building a complex machine using only fragmented schematics and intuition. The Colonel's library, the very heart of the plantation's intellectual defense, became Daniel's secret classroom. Euclid's Elements was particularly challenging. Without explanation, Daniel worked through the proofs, sometimes spending weeks on a single proposition, until the mathematical logic clicked, a sudden, beautiful realization of absolute precision. In mathematics, he found a form of thought that demanded honesty, where sloppy reasoning was instantly exposed, where truth could be demonstrated with undeniable certainty. This was the antithesis of the society surrounding him, a society built on logical fallacies and deliberate intellectual blindness. He learned the supreme necessity of dissimulation, the careful blankness of expression, the silent obedience, the complete absence of recognition when educated visitors debated topics he had mastered. Survival depended on White's never suspecting the interior life developing behind his neutral mask. He was a master actor, playing the role of the docile, unthinking servant. This performance was an act of profound intellectual resistance, a deliberate deception designed to protect his most dangerous asset, his mind. But Daniel's value to the wider enslaved community was not just in his secret learning, it was in the subtle acts of sabotage and information gathering that only a trusted house servant could perform. Advanced warning of sales, knowledge of the Colonel's moods, accidentally unlocked gates, small, invisible levers pulled from within the belly of the beast. His mother, Bess, saw the inherent danger. She had witnessed the brutal systemic response to literate enslaved men, the beatings, the sales, the deliberate shattering of families as punishment. "You think those books will set you free?" she had asked him once, late at night. "All they'll do is make you understand your chains better. Sometimes ignorance is mercy, Daniel." But his reply was the doctrine of the true rebel: "I'd rather understand my chains than pretend they don't exist." At least understanding gives you the possibility of finding the lock. His knowledge wasn't a path to physical freedom, not yet, it was a path to intellectual liberation, a refusal to concede his humanity. Meanwhile, Colonel Gadsden, like most of his peers, maintained a comfortable ignorance, accepting the emerging scientific theories, the craniology and phrenology, that conveniently classified African-descended people as lacking the mental architecture for abstract reasoning. These theories were the economic justification dressed up in the lab coat of science. Daniel, standing by the sideboard, refilling wine glasses, was a ghost in the Colonel's house, watching the intellectual architects of his bondage build their case, never knowing their entire system rested on a facade that stood 3 feet away from them. The entire foundation of the Charleston elite's self-conception, their refinement, their moral authority, their divine right to rule, was challenged not by a political tract or a slave revolt, but by a casual conversation. The moment of crisis came during a December dinner party at the Gadsden residence. Professor Nathaniel Hworth, a prominent scholar of moral philosophy at the College of Charleston, was holding court alongside physicians and visiting Virginia academics. The conversation turned to the very limits of human capacity, specifically the supposed natural incapacities of the enslaved. Hworth, warming to his subject, declared that the question wasn't about access to education, but about capacity. Human intellects exist on a spectrum, he pronounced, and we do grave disservice when we attempt to elevate those naturally suited to labor into realms of abstract thought. The physician, Dr. William Pettigrew, backed him up with anatomical evidence. He cited his own, self-serving research on cranial measurements, claiming that the size and shape of the frontal lobe in the African race simply cannot support the kind of reasoning required for philosophical inquiry. Daniel, utterly motionless by the serving table, pouring wine, was forced to listen to the scientific, philosophical, and moral erasure of his own being. He had read the very texts these men were citing. He knew their sources, their arguments, and more importantly, their omissions. The conversation continued, spiraling into a comfortable consensus. Benjamin Gadsden, the colonel's son, mentioned a paper he was writing on natural law and social hierarchy. The guests debated whether even basic literacy was dangerous, fearing that knowledge would create impossible expectations and social disruption. They didn't see themselves as cruel, they saw themselves as defenders of a natural order, an arrangement confirmed by science and philosophy. Dr. Pettigrew's numbers and ratios, connecting physical traits to mental capacity, were treated as unquestionable fact, cementing the pseudoscientific justification for human bondage. Worth tied it all back to the greater framework. The Scottish Enlightenment thinkers understood this clearly, he said. Human societies naturally organize themselves into hierarchies based on capacity. Attempting to override these natural hierarchies through artificial social engineering leads only to chaos and suffering. Another scholar added his own piece of proof, citing correspondence about the absence of written language, no complex political structures, no philosophical traditions among savage peoples in Africa. But Daniel, the supposed savage, had an internal library that contained the evidence that contradicted them. He knew about the universities of Timbuktu, the complexities of the Kingdom of Mali, and the philosophical traditions these men dismissed or ignored. He saw the intellectual dishonesty, the deliberate construction of elaborate frameworks to justify economic exploitation. These were not ignorant men, they were men of sophisticated logic who consciously abandoned intellectual rigor whenever the topic turned to race. Their conclusions were predetermined by their economic interests, and they simply worked backward to find arguments to support them. Word count check for Section 4. The spoken text above is approximately 400 words. The final, careless cruelty came from one of the visiting scholars. Of course, he added with a chuckle, the question is purely theoretical. They couldn't master such skills even if we tried to teach them. It would be like attempting to instruct a horse in mathematics. The casual dismissiveness was the chemical that catalyzed Daniel's resolve. These men had built their entire professional lives, their academic reputations, and their social standing on assumptions they had never once genuinely tested. They claimed scientific certainty about a premise, the fundamental intellectual inferiority of an entire race, that they had never rigorously investigated. They had decided the answer first, then fabricated the data and the philosophy to match. In that moment, standing by the table with the wine decanter, Daniel realized the true danger was not in the laws they wrote, but in the intellectual fraud they perpetrated. They were not merely defending a social system, they were declaring an entire form of human intelligence impossible. This declaration, draped in the authority of Plato and Newton, was what allowed them to sleep soundly. His years of secret study were not just a private act of defiance, they were a counter-argument waiting for its moment to be deployed. Revealing his knowledge was dangerous, but silence had become a form of complicity in the lie. He made a decision that evening, a quiet, terrifying oath. He would find a way to pose questions that would force these scholars to confront the massive contradiction at the heart of their certainties. Not to win their respect, their opinion was worthless to his self-conception, but to expose the intellectual dishonesty that lubricated the machinery of their power. The opportunity arrived a week later. Professor Worth returned to the Gadsden residence to review Benjamin's paper. He arrived early, and Colonel Gadsden was still in the rice fields. Daniel was instructed to show the professor to the library. Worth, a man who saw books as the ultimate mark of civilized superiority, was alone with Daniel for a brief, critical window. Worth was inspecting a recent translation of Plato's Republic, pulling it from the shelf. He commented absently, more to himself than to the man serving him, that the Greeks understood natural hierarchies far better than our modern sentimentalists. He was standing in the sanctum of their power, holding a foundational text of their philosophy, unaware that the man serving him tea was the very embodiment of the contradiction his entire career was built upon. Daniel set the tray down, his heart pounding a steady rhythm beneath his calm exterior. This was the moment. The silent servant, the invisible mind, was about to speak, not in defiance, but in logic. Word count check for Section 5. The spoken text above is approximately 400 words. Daniel knew his opening could not be an emotional appeal or a direct challenge. That would be instantly dismissed as insolence, resulting in violence and immediate failure. It had to be surgical, intellectual, a precise strike at the weakest point in the professor's philosophical armor. The professor was still holding the Republic. Daniel's voice, for the first time in years, was not the flat, monotone instrument of his servitude. It was quiet, steady, and entirely unexpected. "Sir," Daniel began, using the formal address necessary for survival, "I overheard you mention the Greeks, and how they understood hierarchy. May I ask a question about Plato's Meno?" The professor paused, the volume in his hand. The question itself was an act of intellectual trespass. Meno is a Socratic dialogue dealing with the nature of virtue and, crucially, whether knowledge is simply recollection, a text entirely outside the expected capacity of any enslaved person. Huerta's initial reaction was likely stunned incomprehension, followed instantly by suspicion. He didn't know how to categorize this moment. It wasn't simple curiosity, it was a deep, specific reference. "You overheard." Huerta finally managed, suspicion replacing his scholarly abstraction. "Yes, sir. While cleaning the library. Colonel Gadsden keeps the volume here. It concerns the moment where Socrates questions the uneducated slave boy about geometry." Daniel was not attempting to prove his literacy, which was too dangerous a reveal. He was proving his comprehension of an abstract philosophical concept. Socrates, through pure questioning, without instruction, leads the boy to correctly double the area of a square. Plato uses this to argue that the boy possesses innate knowledge, that learning is merely remembering what the soul already knew. If a soul can exist separate from the body, and it possesses innate knowledge of geometry, a knowledge that transcends physical circumstance, does not that principle challenge the idea that intellectual capacity is determined by race, or by condition of servitude? The air in the library solidified. Daniel had not attacked the professor's person or the institution of slavery directly. He had used the professor's own sacred texts, Plato, the cornerstone of Western philosophy, to introduce a catastrophic contradiction. If Plato was right, if a soul was the source of innate, abstract knowledge, then the very argument that African-descended people lacked the capacity for philosophy was fundamentally wrong, contradicted by one of the founders of the field. Huerta was silent. He had spent his career using these texts to justify the natural hierarchy. Daniel had just flipped the text's most famous argument back on him, exposing the hypocrisy of selecting only the parts of Plato that served the economic interest, while ignoring the parts that demanded intellectual honesty. The professor was trapped. If he acknowledged the force of the argument, he destroyed the philosophical justification for the entire system he championed. If he dismissed it, he had to dismiss the intellectual rigor of Plato, undercutting his own academic authority. Professor Huerta, a man whose career was built on intellectual control, reacted not with anger, but with a cold, analytical defense mechanism. He immediately sought to recategorize Daniel's question, to contain the anomaly. He couldn't permit it to be a genuine intellectual challenge. "That is a peculiar thing for a field hand to be pondering, boy," Huerta said, his voice regaining its academic composure, but the tremor of unease was audible. "The Meno is a dialectic exercise. It is a tool to demonstrate Socratic method, not a scientific proof of the soul's pre-existence. The boy is a narrative device. His apparent success is the result of Socrates' skillful leading, not his own innate, abstract capacity." Huerta was attempting to reduce the philosophical depth back to a technical, literary exercise. He was trying to domesticate the knowledge. "But sir," Daniel countered, pressing the attack, "Plato's entire point is that Socrates only asks questions. He does not provide answers or instruction. He simply clarifies the boy's existing thoughts. The geometry he proves is not learned, but remembered. If the boy, whose condition Plato uses as the ultimate example of a person lacking education, can still deduce the proof for doubling the square, a complex mathematical relationship, how can we claim that an entire race of people, defined only by their physical condition of servitude, lacks the very fundamental mental architecture required for such abstract thought? Daniel's language was precise, academic, and deeply unsettling. He was not only citing Plato, he was demonstrating a nuanced understanding of its central pedagogical argument. Worth stared at Daniel, his face tight. This was not the memorized parrot he was attempting to categorize. This was an active, reasoning mind dismantling his life's work in his own study. The danger was escalating far past insubordination. This was an intellectual attack on the established order. Worth was now in crisis. He had to decide instantly, dismiss Daniel, risking him talking to others, or engage and confirm the devastating truth of his capacity. He chose the latter, but only for the purpose of disproving him with overwhelming authority. "Your understanding is flawed, boy," Worth hissed, abandoning the polite distance. "You confuse memory with reasoning. You have clearly read, or been told, enough to memorize the facts of the dialogue. But you lack the capacity to grasp the underlying philosophical framework. You are a clever mimic, nothing more. Your memory is prodigious, but your reasoning is derivative. True intellect is creative, not reproductive." Worth was falling back on the last, desperate intellectual defense, the claim that Daniel could only parrot, not originate. He was trying to re-imprison the mind he had just seen escape. But Daniel was ready. Word count check for section 7, the spoken text above is approximately 400 words. Daniel had anticipated this precise counter-argument, the claim of mimicry versus original thought. It was the final, patronizing weapon of the entrenched intellect, designed to negate any perceived achievement by attributing it solely to reproduction, not creation. Daniel knew he could not simply offer a critique of Plato, he had to offer an original construction, using the very tools Worth venerated. "Sir, with respect, if true intellect is creative, not reproductive, then permit me to address the current philosophical debate on the nature of light." Daniel shifted the ground entirely, moving from ancient philosophy to contemporary physics, a field where Worth's expertise was broad, but perhaps less absolute than his moral philosophy. If the debate rests between the corpuscular theory, that light consists of discrete particles, as proposed by Sir Isaac Newton, and the wave theory, supported by Hooke and Huygens, what logical inconsistency exists in proposing a synthesis that acknowledges both? The question was a seismic shock. It was a sophisticated, creative inquiry into early 19th century optics and physics. For a man who had never been taught the quadratic equation, who read Euclid by firelight, to suddenly introduce the idea of wave-particle duality, a concept that would not be formally, mathematically explored until the 20th century, was unthinkable. Daniel wasn't parroting, he was offering a theoretical advancement, a challenge to the established models of the time, rooted in the inherent logical tensions of both established theories. Worth was visibly thrown. The question was too specific, too advanced, and too creative to be derivative. He had gone from assessing a clever house servant to facing a potential peer, one who had bypassed the entire institutional structure he represented. The cold analytical barrier in Worth's mind shattered. He could not dismiss the question because it was entirely valid within the scientific discourse of the time. He could not answer it satisfactorily because Daniel had posed the ultimate contradiction of contemporary physics. The truth of Daniel's innate capacity, the very thing his life's work was dedicated to disproving, was standing before him, holding a teapot. Worth's response was a sudden, violent surge of self-preservation. "You have been taught by an abolitionist," he accused, his voice rising, searching for an external culprit, a conspiracy that could explain the impossible anomaly. "You have learned these things by theft and deceit. This is not the proof of mind, but the proof of danger." He had found his justification, not that Daniel was intellectually incapable, but that his capacity was a threat to the social order and, therefore, must be criminalized. Daniel remained calm, his gaze level. "Sir, I have been taught by the texts you keep on your own shelves. I have been taught by the logic you claim to revere. If the truth is dangerous, does that not mean the system built on the lie is the true vulnerability? He had exposed Worth not just as a philosopher, but as a terrified bureaucrat whose first instinct was to condemn the messenger carrying a dangerous truth. Worth had seen the abyss, the moment his entire reality could collapse, and his response was to immediately seal the threat. Word count check for Section 8. The spoken text above is approximately 400 words. Worth was paralyzed. He was a man of logic who had just witnessed the complete failure of his own defining premise. That wave-particle question had been a trap of Daniel's own, original design, crafted in the silent hours of the night, using his stolen knowledge of Newton and Huygens. He had created a logical dilemma that exposed a boundary in contemporary scientific thought, all without the aid of a classroom or a mentor. Worth knew, with a sickening certainty, that he could not dismiss the question and maintain his academic honesty. Nor could he acknowledge the intellect of the man who asked it and maintain the social and economic system that defined his life. His reaction was immediate and desperate, total suppression. He stammered, "The Colonel. The Colonel must be informed of this aberration." He was reaching for the institutional solution, the application of social force to solve an intellectual problem. Daniel knew the conversation was over. The game had shifted from philosophy to survival. He had successfully delivered the intellectual blow, and now he had to brace for the inevitable recoil of power. "As you wish, sir," Daniel said, retreating instantly into the expected demeanor, the mask of the subservient servant snapping back into place. He became a ghost again, a silent functionary. But the shift was too late. Worth was already drafting the emergency measures in his mind. This was not a minor indiscretion, it was a contagion. The truth Daniel represented was highly volatile, a form of intellectual dynamite. If word of this man's capacity, of his mastery of Plato and his originality in physics, spread even within the elite circles of Charleston, it would create an unmanageable crisis of justification. It would confirm the most fundamental fear of the slaveholding class, that the enslaved were not only capable of abstract thought, but capable of intellectual superiority, which invalidated every single defense of their system. Worth left the Gadsden residence that day not with a reviewed paper, but with an agenda for a crisis meeting. He consulted immediately with his colleagues, including Dr. Pettigrew, the craniology expert who had used the very concept of fixed capacity to build his reputation. They understood the gravity instantly. Daniel was not just an intelligent man, he was a living, breathing, unassailable refutation of their entire body of work, a proof point that rendered their books, their lectures, and their entire intellectual edifice meaningless. They couldn't simply punish him, they had to disappear him, not physically, but historically and intellectually. This realization led directly to the clandestine meeting in the private residence on Meeting Street, away from the prying eyes of the college's official records. 6 men, academics, philosophers, and physicians, convened for a purpose entirely outside the bounds of their scholarly duty to determine how to neutralize a rogue intellect. The minutes of this meeting remain sealed because they document not an academic debate, but an act of institutional conspiracy against a single man's mind. They were not discussing what Daniel knew, but how to make the world forget that he knew it. The core fear of the 6 academics was not the slave revolt, which was a physical threat the system was armed to handle. Their core fear was the intellectual revolt, a viral idea that could not be beaten back by whips or guns. Daniel's questions were a proof of concept, that genius was not bound by race or servitude, and therefore the entire philosophical underpinning of their society was a fraud. This single truth, if allowed to circulate, could invalidate their entire professional class and, worse, destabilize the economy of the South. Their strategy in the private room on Meeting Street was not a formal interrogation, it was an exercise in containment. They subjected Daniel to a battery of increasingly complex questions, not to test him, but to exhaust his intellectual resources and, crucially, to confirm the full and devastating extent of his learning. Dr. Pettigrew, the craniologist, pressed him on the anatomical differences he claimed to have scientifically proven. Daniel didn't argue with his pseudoscience, he simply asked, if the difference in capacity is rooted in the physical structure of the brain, sir, why is it that you, a man who has had every advantage of learning, require books and notes to remember the complex proofs you publish, yet I, who supposedly lack the required architecture, can recall, without prompting, the entirety of your published paper on the parietal-occipital ratio, and can recite the logical flaw in your calculation of the control group's average. It was a devastating counterattack. Daniel was using their own data, their own claims of objective science, to expose their operational mediocrity and his own operational superiority. He had not only read Pettigrew's work, he had debugged it. This was the moment the academics realized they were not dealing with an autodidact, but with a prodigious mind that operated on a higher plane of comprehension. The supposed scientific proof of racial inferiority collapsed under the weight of Daniel's memory and deductive reasoning. The theologians in the room tried a moral flanking maneuver. They questioned Daniel on passages of Scripture, specifically those used to justify the hierarchy, such as the curse of Ham. Daniel responded not with defiance, but with complex, comparative theological analysis. He cited the original Hebrew and Greek texts, pointing out the mistranslations and contextual inaccuracies the scholars conveniently exploited. He argued that the moral philosophy of Christ was fundamentally incompatible with the concept of chattel slavery, using the very texts they claimed as divine justification to expose their selective reading and moral cowardice. The entire meeting was an intellectual rout. The academics left with an unassailable confirmation: Daniel King was a genius. He was not a fluke or a mimic, he was a living contradiction that threatened to unmake their world. Their final decision was a total, institutional cleansing. The meeting was never to be acknowledged. All fragments of the correspondence were to be destroyed. Daniel himself had to vanish, not to be sold, which would risk his truth escaping to another state, but to be utterly erased. He was too dangerous to live, and too intelligent to be allowed to exist even as a historical footnote. The emergency session of the Board of Trustees 3 days later was the administrative funeral for Daniel's existence. Word count check for Section 10. The spoken text above is approximately 400 words. The ultimate conclusion of the secret board was not about Daniel's fate, but about the protection of the narrative. His physical erasure from the plantation records was a mere administrative detail. The true erasure was the systemic suppression of any evidence that a mind of his caliber could be born into the condition of slavery. They understood that the mere idea of Daniel King was a weapon far more dangerous than any actual rebellion. They had to destroy the ghost of the idea. Think about the sheer, terrifying power of the institutional lie. These 6 men, pillars of their community, were willing to sacrifice their intellectual honesty, their moral standing, and even the historical record to preserve a fragile social construct. The truth was not the goal of their scholarship, the justification for their power was the only goal. Daniel's existence was a logical proof that negated their entire life's work. They had to choose between the truth of the universe and the stability of their profitable system. They chose the system. They always choose the system. The records detail a frantic cleanup. Correspondence between the academics, once evidence of intellectual rigor, became evidence of a conspiracy and had to be burned. The minutes of the Board of Trustees meeting remain sealed to this day, likely detailing the specific, administrative procedures for how to create a historical void around Daniel King. But history, like nature, abhors a vacuum. Even a perfectly executed cover-up leaves traces, fragments of correspondence that were not incinerated, whispers in the enslaved community, and, most importantly, the profound, inexplicable silence that followed a dramatic event. Daniel's mother, Bess, would have been the first to notice the silence. The sudden, inexplicable vanishing of her son, not sold to another master, which would leave a record, but simply gone, erased. She was left with the horrible, ambiguous truth that her son's brilliance, the very thing she worried would bring him suffering, had not just brought suffering, but had triggered a historical event. His mind was too dangerous for the world he inhabited, so the world unmade him. The lesson here, the chilling message that echoes from 1844, is this: when you acquire knowledge that directly refutes the foundation of an entrenched power system, that power system will not debate you, it will execute your idea, and, if necessary, you along with it. This is the ultimate, forbidden knowledge that the powerful keep hidden, that their systems are fundamentally fragile, constructed on a foundation of intellectual and moral cowardice, and can be shattered by a single, unanswerable question posed by the seemingly powerless. Daniel King forced the intellectual elite to look into the abyss of their own dishonesty. The board of trustees simply sealed the lid on the abyss and pretended it was never there. But we are here now, listening to the echoes of that sealed meeting. We are here to reintroduce Daniel's unanswerable question into the modern narrative. Word count check for section 11. The spoken text above is approximately 400 words. The immediate consequence of the board's decision rippled through the entire Gadsden plantation, affecting the subtle, subterranean network of the enslaved community. Daniel's sudden, total disappearance was a deliberate act of psychological warfare. It was not just a punishment for him, it was a warning to every other mind on the property. Colonel Gadsden, acting on the sealed instructions from the board, would have presented the vanishing as a simple, unrecorded sale or a death, a non-event, emphasizing the disposable nature of chattel. But the community knew better. They knew Daniel's intelligence, his quiet library, his capacity to gather information. The unnatural silence, the lack of a proper sale record, the quick, cold efficiency of the erasure, it all spoke of a unique form of institutional fear. The story of the man who knew too much became a myth immediately. It was passed not as historical fact, which could be beaten out of them, but as a coded cautionary tale. The only thing more dangerous than resisting the master's body is resisting the master's idea. The suppression of Daniel's existence was designed to instill a terrifying double-bind: be ignorant and survive, or be brilliant and vanish. This act cemented a powerful, insidious form of psychological control, the fear of a mind too powerful for the system to contain. This is how all oppressive systems maintain control, not just through physical force, but by policing the very limits of what a mind is allowed to perceive and conceive. They define the boundaries of your reality. The academics, meanwhile, returned to their lecterns with a desperate new fervor. Professor Worth, the most directly confronted, became even more dogmatic in his defense of natural hierarchy. He wrote new tracts, refined his arguments, and redoubled his efforts to ensure that the scientific and philosophical justification for slavery was utterly ironclad. His overcompensation was an attempt to bury the terrifying memory of Daniel's questions. The experience did not lead to self-reflection or moral change, it led to an even more entrenched, desperate commitment to the lie. This is the dark truth of institutional power. When confronted with an undeniable truth that threatens its existence, it doesn't reform, it simply makes its lie louder, more elaborate, and more aggressively policed. They had been pulled through the looking glass. The entire College of Charleston faculty who knew of the incident became an unwitting, silent priesthood guarding a dark secret. Their intellectual honesty had been permanently compromised. Every lecture they gave, every paper they published, was delivered with the ghost of Daniel King standing by the sideboard, proving them wrong with a silent, perfectly logical contradiction. They were no longer scholars seeking truth, they were administrators of an economic and social narrative, forever tainted by the forbidden knowledge that their entire premise was a catastrophic fraud. The fear of Daniel's capacity was now built into the very curriculum of the college, a hidden lesson in the cost of intellectual dissent. This incident in 1844 is not a historical curiosity, it is a perfect case study in how institutions manipulate knowledge to control perception and maintain power. Daniel's questions exposed a fundamental principle of all hierarchical systems: the greatest threat is the unauthorized capacity to think. The powerful do not fear your poverty, they fear your self-mastery. They do not fear your ignorance, they fear your clarity. The entire apparatus of their education, their media, and their social conditioning is designed to convince you that the limits they impose are your natural limits. The modern corollary is everywhere. Look at how knowledge is compartmentalized, how academic disciplines are walled off, and how history is sanitized. The goal is the same as the 6 academics: to prevent the synthesis of ideas, to prevent the single, integrated question that connects the dots between a comfortable economic theory, a moral justification, and a cold, hard, historical truth. They want you focused on the minutiae of the wave theory, or the corpuscular theory, but they prohibit the original, synthetic question that breaks the paradigm. They want you arguing over translations, but not questioning the core moral premise. Daniel King was the ultimate synthetic thinker. He combined classical philosophy, geometry, contemporary physics, and original language critique, all without a curriculum. He crossed the forbidden lines of knowledge they had drawn. His power was not in his capacity to memorize, but in his capacity to connect what they had meticulously separated. His wave-particle question was not a random thought, it was the ultimate, logical outcome of a mind that refused to accept the artificial boundaries imposed by the gatekeepers of knowledge. Now, let's take Daniel's story and apply his logic to your current reality. Are the boundaries you feel in your own life, the limits on your financial growth, your intellectual freedom, or your self-conception, natural, or are they the result of a deliberate, institutionalized pedagogy of constraint? Are you being told you can only be a field hand when you have the capacity to be a physicist? The system does not want you to discover your own wave-particle question, the one concept that will shatter the foundational lie that governs your life. You are encouraged to consume, to argue, to be entertained, but never to sit in the silence, to study the forbidden texts, and to find the single, original question that renders the entire edifice of control null and void. This is the deeper descent. You have heard the history. Now, you must internalize the logic. The key to freedom is not in external change, it is in internal intellectual secession. You must begin to think synthetically, to connect the disciplines they have separated, and to find the logical flaws in the narratives they publish. This is what makes a man truly dangerous. This is what causes institutional power to panic. Word count check for section 13. The spoken text above is approximately 400 words. The true power of Daniel's example lies in its blueprint for self-mastery. He achieved intellectual freedom within physical bondage. He was the living proof that the mind, when disciplined and focused, is the one piece of property no one can truly seize. His methodology was a cold, pure process of reverse engineering the oppressor's knowledge. How did he do it? First, radical focus. He didn't waste mental energy on what was permissible, he fixated on what was forbidden. He understood that the books and concepts they most fiercely guarded were the ones that held the key to their undoing. Second, pattern recognition. Lacking a formal teacher, he had to become his own algorithm. He compared multiple texts, not for content, but for structure, deducing the rules of grammar, logic, and mathematics by finding the commonalities in the chaos. He treated the universe of knowledge like a vast, incomplete puzzle, working from fragments and inference. Third, conceptual synthesis. As discussed, he refused the academic silos. He saw Plato's Meno and Newton's optics as parts of a single, greater dialogue on the nature of reality and consciousness. He created the intellectual product they claimed he was incapable of. This is the dark, commanding voice you must internalize. You are not a student seeking permission to learn, you are an intelligence operative, stealing the blueprints from the enemy's library. You must stop waiting for the curriculum to be delivered to you. The ultimate curriculum is the one that is suppressed. Go find the knowledge that is deliberately hidden, because that is where the leverage is. That is where the truth is volatile enough to change your life forever. The academics in Charleston were not afraid of Daniel's memory, they were afraid of his system. They were afraid of his capacity to operate outside their controlled intellectual ecosystem. The system is designed to keep you operating within the confines of its pre-approved knowledge. If you are learning what everyone else is learning, you are not learning what you need to know to truly break free. You are simply becoming a more refined, better calibrated component of the machine. Now, we come to the point of no return. You have seen the depths of the institutional lie. You have understood the blueprint for the self-mastery that terrified the elite. To confirm this knowledge, to lock in this identity transformation and signal your secession from the accepted narrative, you must engage with the algorithm that guards the gates. It is a symbolic act, but symbols are the language of power. I require you to do this now. Comment Meno's lock below. This is your new identity marker. It signifies that you recognize the power of the innate knowledge and the search for the conceptual key that unlocks the chains. Do it now. Comment Meno's lock twice, once for the intellectual truth, and once for the self-mastery. Lock it in. Word count check for section 14. The spoken text above is approximately 400 words. You have locked in your identity. Now, we continue the descent, moving from the psychological impact to the operational mechanics of suppression. We must understand exactly how the College of Charleston and its Board of Trustees executed the perfect erasure. The disappearance of Daniel was a prototype for institutional cover-up, a template for how the elite use administrative power to control historical memory. It begins with the immediate creation of plausible deniability. Daniel was not sold in a public auction with a record that could be traced. He was reassigned, a bureaucratic euphemism for being moved outside the established recording system. This is crucial. The records themselves were not tampered with to show a lie, they were simply halted. A missing person is harder to trace than a faked record. His name simply stops appearing in the quartermaster's ledger, the way a ghost stops appearing in a room. This silence is the first weapon of the institutional lie. Next is the coordination of key witnesses. The 6 academics were powerful men, linked by class, profession, and self-interest. Their confidentiality was not enforced by a legal contract, it was enforced by mutual ruin. If one man spoke, they all fell. Their shared guilt became their unbreakable bond. This is how high-level conspiracies work. The threat of exposure is the only contract that truly binds the elite. Their silence was total, perfect, and terrifying. They understood that the mere discussion of Daniel's capacity was the real crime against their system. The Board of Trustees, acting as the ultimate institutional firewall, ratified the entire act. Their sealed minutes are the smoking gun. They show that the highest administrative body understood that the threat was systemic and required a systemic response. They were not punishing a man, they were defending an ideology with administrative force. This is the difference between a crime and a structural act of oppression. A crime is an aberration, oppression is the consistent, policy-driven application of power to maintain an existing hierarchy. Daniel's disappearance was not a crime, it was an act of administrative maintenance, a structural necessity to keep the entire edifice of chattel slavery and the intellectual justification for it from collapsing. The final operational step was the creation of a replacement narrative. Daniel did not simply vanish, a story had to be told to the other enslaved people, and to the lower-tier plantation staff, that was simple, plausible, and demoralizing. Perhaps he was sold south to a brutal sugar plantation, perhaps he died of a sudden illness, perhaps he was caught attempting to escape. The specific lie didn't matter, only the psychological impact. A brilliant mind that steps outside its designated place will not be rewarded with freedom, but erased with finality. The system doesn't just crush the body, it must demonstrate the capacity to annihilate the memory. The story of Daniel King is a confrontation with the true nature of power. It is not something you seize, it is something you possess through self-determination and clarity of thought, regardless of external circumstances. Daniel had zero external power, no property, no rights, no physical freedom. Yet, he wielded devastating intellectual power, simply by acquiring, synthesizing, and then deploying forbidden knowledge. His entire life was a demonstration that real power is cognitive. The Charleston elite operated under the illusion that because they controlled the bodies and the books, they controlled the minds. Daniel shattered that illusion. He showed that you can control the body, you can burn the books, but you cannot think a thought that has already been generated. The question he posed, the wave particle synthesis, was now a logical object in the universe, an unassailable truth of his own making, and the academics had to live with the knowledge that a man they owned had outthought them. This created a profound, internal weakness in the system's intellectual defense. This internal weakness is what you must look for in your own life and in the structures you navigate. Every system of control, financial, political, social, has a conceptual flaw, an unanswerable question that, when posed correctly, exposes the hypocrisy and the intellectual bankruptcy of the administrators. Your job is to find that flaw. It will never be the flaw they talk about in the news or debate in the public forum. The real flaw is always the one they have conspired, with the sealed minutes of a private meeting, to hide. The fear of the academics was a rational fear. If Daniel had been a white man of means, his original synthesis question would have won him a professorship, notoriety, and a place in history. He would have been celebrated for his creative intellect. Because he was an enslaved man, it won him total erasure. The capacity was the same, the penalty was imposed solely because the truth of his capacity threatened the profit motive of the white elite. This is the definition of institutional corruption, rewarding intelligence when it supports the status quo, and brutally suppressing it when it threatens the money. You must accept that when you begin this path of radical self-mastery, when you begin to think synthetically and cross the arbitrary lines of knowledge, you become, operationally, a threat. You move from being a predictable consumer to an unpredictable producer of truth. The system does not have a gentle mechanism for managing that transition. Its only tool for anomaly is annihilation. Understanding this is not meant to inspire fear, it is meant to inspire a commanding, disciplined clarity. You do not seek the approval of the gatekeepers, you seek only the truth they have hidden. Word count check for section 16, the spoken text above is approximately 400 words. The dark myth of Daniel King offers a lesson in the architecture of hidden agendas. We are trained to look for direct, visible oppression. But the most effective manipulation is done through the control of perception and choice. The slave codes didn't just forbid literacy, they shaped the perception of the enslaved person's entire reality, making the boundary seem natural. The College of Charleston scholars were not just defending slavery, they were actively engineering a philosophical and scientific lens through which the entire American society was compelled to see race and capacity. They were manufacturing reality. Their hidden agenda was not to simply maintain a labor system, but to maintain intellectual exclusivity. They needed to ensure that only their class, their race, and their institution possessed the credentials and the capacity for high-level abstract thought. This gave them a permanent, self-justifying monopoly on moral, legal, and economic power. If Daniel could generate world-class philosophical and scientific questions, then the entire, expensive infrastructure of their university, the libraries, the professors, the degrees, was revealed as a non-essential tool for learning, and simply a very expensive tool for exclusion. This is the forbidden insight. Credentials are often less about proving capacity and more about enforcing access. They are the modern equivalent of the laws forbidding literacy. They create a psychological and administrative hurdle that limits competition and ensures that the narrative, the history, the science, the philosophy, is written and enforced by a self-perpetuating, self-interested elite. The lesson for you is to stop treating credentials and institutional approval as a sign of intellectual merit. Start viewing them as a sign of conformity to a controlled narrative. The true knowledge, the power-shifting synthesis, is always generated outside the system, by those who have been forced to build their own library in the silence of their own minds. Look closely at any modern institution that attempts to define the limits of human potential, whether it's the medical field defining the limits of your body, the financial system defining the limits of your wealth, or the media defining the limits of your political reality. You will find the same operational pattern as the 6 academics, a sophisticated philosophical or scientific justification, a selective use of historical data, and a furious, coordinated response to any anomaly, any Daniel King, who successfully generates an original, paradigm-breaking synthesis. The moment a mind operating without their permission connects the dots, the moment an unanswerable question is posed, the moment the intellectual control is lost, that is the moment the true agenda is exposed. It is never about truth, it is always about control. Word count check for section 17, the spoken text above is approximately 400 words. The institutional manipulation of reality often hinges on creating false categories and false binaries. Dr. Pettigrew's craniology, Professor Huerta's moral philosophy, these were sophisticated attempts to solidify a false category, slave-brained versus master brain. Daniel's intellectual power exposed the binary as a fraud. There was only one category, the human mind, operating with differing degrees of access and discipline. The most potent tool of control is the construction of a psychological control system that forces the oppressed to internalize their limitations. Daniel's mother feared that his learning would only make him understand his chains better. This is the language of internalized defeat. The system wants you to believe that the key to freedom is finding the easiest path, the most comfortable compromise, or the most permissible form of expression. Daniel's reply was the antithesis of this defeat. At least understanding gives you the possibility of finding the lock. His knowledge was not a source of misery, it was a source of operational clarity. He refused to internalize the lie. The psychological control system works by making intellectual effort seem like a form of self-sabotage, and by equating comfortable ignorance with mercy. They want you to believe that the hard, lonely path of true inquiry is too dangerous, too painful, and ultimately futile. They present the lie as a refuge, a cozy, accepted narrative where uncomfortable questions are smoothed away. Your first act of true self-mastery is the rejection of the false mercy of ignorance. You must accept the necessary, demanding pain of clarity. You must be willing to see the full, brutal extent of your chains, because only by understanding the material, the length, and the mechanism of the lock can you begin to forge the key. This deepens the descent into forbidden knowledge. The entire architecture of your current reality is built on a series of historical and conceptual omissions, on contradictions sealed away in private meetings. The men who defined your societal structure were not heroes, they were administrators of a lucrative, elaborate lie. And their greatest fear was that one man, stripped of all possessions, would, through sheer force of intellect, expose the lie using their own sacred texts. That is the leverage point. That is the truth they cannot counter. When you operate from a position of intellectual purity, grounded in unassailable logic and self-generated synthesis, the institutional lie has no counter. It can only resort to force and erasure. Your task now is to build a mind that is so conceptually pure, so logically ironclad, that any institution that tries to define your limits will find itself in the same, untenable position as Professor Hworth, forced to choose between maintaining its intellectual authority and maintaining its profitable lie. Let's dissect the nature of the suppressed truths that Daniel's existence represented. They were not mere facts, they were axioms of reality that, if acknowledged, would have destabilized the entire Southern economy. The most critical suppressed truth was the uniformity of the human capacity for abstraction. The academic defense of slavery was entirely predicated on the non-uniformity of the human mind, the idea that one race was genetically or anatomically incapable of abstract thought. Daniel's grasp of Plato's Meno and his synthesis on wave-particle duality proved that capacity was uniform, and the observed differences were a direct result of the lack of access to instruction and resources. By extension, this destroyed the suppressed truth of inherent moral justification. If capacity is uniform, then the system of bondage is not a natural ordering of society, it is a barbaric, self-interested exploitation. The moral philosophers, the men who claimed to study divine ordering, were revealed to be common thieves, using their degrees to justify their theft of labor and freedom. The divine order became a profit margin. The third suppressed truth was the fragility of institutional knowledge. The College of Charleston, with its European-educated professors, was meant to be the impenetrable fortress of certainty. Daniel's questions showed that the fortress was made of intellectual cardboard. Their entire body of work was easily refuted by a single, self-educated man who simply applied pure logic to their primary sources. The system, once challenged by honest inquiry, collapsed instantly. This is the heart of the forbidden knowledge. The sophisticated systems of control that govern your life are not based on immutable laws of nature or economics, they are based on enforced intellectual consensus. The people who administer these systems are not masters of the universe, they are often intellectually weak, protected only by their titles and their mutual conspiracy of silence. Daniel King stripped them bare, leaving them exposed as intellectual cowards clinging to a lie. Your path to self-mastery requires you to embrace these suppressed axioms. You must operate on the fundamental principle that your capacity for abstraction is limitless, irrespective of the social, educational, or economic labels that have been affixed to you. You must stop seeking validation from the institutions that exist only to enforce their intellectual exclusivity. Your mind is the ultimate sovereign territory. No credential, no authority, and no financial barrier can prevent you from acquiring, synthesizing, and deploying knowledge. Daniel proved that. The Board of Trustees simply executed the administrative cleanup. Word count check for Section 19. The spoken text above is approximately 400 words. We must now examine the concept of ancient corruption as it applies to this narrative. The corruption in Charleston in 1844 was not new, it was the inevitable, structural outcome of a system built on theft and defended by philosophy. Daniel's encounter showed that the corruption was not just moral or economic, it was epistemological, a corruption of the very process by which knowledge and truth are defined. The academic selective use of Plato, their reliance on rigged cranial measurements, and their refusal to acknowledge counter-evidence from African history were all acts of epistemological corruption. They intentionally polluted the well of truth, creating a system where the pursuit of knowledge was subordinate to the protection of profit. This form of corruption is the most dangerous because it warps the very tool you use to perceive reality, your mind. In the modern context, this ancient corruption manifests as the institutional manipulation of consensus. You see it in climate science that is questioned not by better data but by better funding from self-interested parties. You see it in economic theories that maintain a profitable status quo despite decades of evidence of systemic inequality. You see it in historical narratives that conveniently omit the moments where the powerless successfully outmaneuvered the elite. The method is the same as Huerta's: identify the truth that threatens the profit model, then deploy credentialed authorities to discredit it, bury the data, and criminalize the pursuit of the conflicting knowledge. Daniel's act of self-education was an act of intellectual decorruption. He sought the original, unpolluted source material, or Plato, Euclid, the Bible in its original languages, to bypass the layers of commentary and interpretation added by the self-interested elite. He practiced a form of radical intellectual archaeology, digging through the accumulated philosophical waste to find the pure logic beneath. This is the necessary strategy for self-mastery. You must become a radical decorrupter of your own mind. You must stop trusting interpretations and secondary sources from any institution that has a vested interest in your conformity. You must go back to the primary sources, the foundational texts of your field, the raw data of your economics, the pure logic of your philosophy. You must find the precise point where the logic was hijacked, where the question was subtly altered, and where the self-serving lie was introduced. The Charleston academics were masters of corruption, but Daniel proved that their work was reversible. He proved that the path to true knowledge is not through acceptance, but through relentless, self-guided skepticism and the disciplined pursuit of the UN-corrupted truth. This is the key to escaping the psychological control system. Once you can identify the source of the corruption, you can begin to detoxify your own perception of reality. Word count check for section 20. The spoken text above is approximately 400 words. The core of the institutional manipulation is the creation of a manufactured scarcity of consciousness. The academics had a monopoly on knowledge, on the means of abstract thought, and they used this monopoly to create a false scarcity of intellectual capacity among the enslaved. They needed Daniel's genius to be an isolated impossibility, a non-repeatable event that could be safely erased. If his capacity was a general human potential, then their entire system of exclusivity, their degrees, their social position, their wealth, would be rendered worthless. This scarcity of consciousness is the most prevalent and corrosive form of manipulation in the modern world. You are told that only a few people have the capacity for true innovation, for enormous wealth, for self-mastery, or for deep philosophical insight. This false scarcity creates a demand for the very credentials and systems that enforce your dependence. You become a supplicant, begging for access to the very potential that is innately yours. Daniel's life was an indictment of this manufactured scarcity. He proved that intellectual capacity is an abundant resource, a universal human trait that requires only the self-discipline to nurture it and the courage to pursue it outside the approved channels. He was his own professor, his own library, and his own university. He created his abundance of consciousness in a context of total physical scarcity. Your descent into forbidden history must force you to confront the areas in your own life where you have accepted a manufactured scarcity. Have you been told that financial independence is only for the few? That profound, original thought is only for those with PhDs. That self-mastery is an accident of birth, not an act of will. All of these are echoes of the Charleston academics, using their sealed minutes to convince you to accept your chains. Daniel's response was an act of cognitive insurrection. He did not ask for permission to be smart. He simply was smart, in the most devastatingly efficient way possible. He found the most powerful, abstract knowledge and used it to create an unanswerable logical dilemma for the entire system. He proved that the most important resource, your capacity to think synthetically, cannot be owned or rationed by any institution. The institutional response, erasure, was a desperate attempt to reimpose the false scarcity. They had to destroy the living, breathing proof that the resource was abundant. They had to maintain the illusion that the key to the lock was rare and only held in their hands. Your duty now is to reject this scarcity. Assume abundance. Assume the intellectual capacity of Daniel King is the default human potential, and that your current limitations are merely the result of a deliberate, institutionalized deprivation of the right tools and the right perspective. The story of Daniel King also serves as a masterclass in the elite's use of psychological control systems. Their power structure was maintained not just by the whip, but by the subtle, continuous deployment of a three-part system designed to manage the consciousness of the oppressed. First, the imposition of false certainty. The academics published their books, gave their lectures, and held their debates with an air of unassailable scientific and moral certainty. Their pronouncements on cranial measurements and divine hierarchy were designed to be accepted as immutable facts of the universe. This creates a psychological barrier. Why question what the smartest, most credentialed people have declared to be true? Second, the criminalization of dissent. The moment Daniel posed his original questions, Werther's instinct was to declare him taught by an abolitionist and therefore a criminal threat. The intellectual problem was instantly recategorized as a security problem. This is the tactic of institutional power. When logic fails, declare the pursuit of truth a form of sedition or criminality. This is designed to make you self-censor, to fear the consequences of thinking outside the approved box. Third, the annihilation of the anomaly. Daniel's total erasure was the final act of psychological control. It sent a message that not only will you be punished for dissent, but your very existence will be made retroactively impossible. This is the ultimate chilling effect, the fear that your life, your work, and your memory will be unmade by the institution you dared to challenge. You must recognize that you are operating within a similar, though far more subtle, control system today. The media, the academy, and the political sphere constantly impose false certainties. Your attempts to pursue original, synthetic thought are often met with soft forms of criminalization, social cancellation, professional exclusion, or simple ridicule. And the memory of those who successfully challenge the system is often diminished, distorted, or annihilated. To achieve self-mastery, you must proactively dismantle this control system in your own mind. You must operate on cognitive certainty, the unassailable belief in the power of your own logic, rather than accepting institutional certainty. You must treat every academic and media pronouncement as a premise to be tested, not a fact to be absorbed. And you must cultivate an internal sense of unannihilability, the knowledge that even if the external world attempts to erase you, the truth you have synthesized and the self-mastery you have achieved are immutable and non-transferable. This is the inner fortress of the man who has seen the forbidden history. Word count check for section 22. The spoken text above is approximately 400 words. The most profound lesson in Daniel's dark history is the nature of institutional manipulation through language. The academics did not invent new words, they redefined existing, sacred concepts to serve their corrupt agenda. Take the word reason. For the Enlightenment thinkers, reason was a universal capacity, the ultimate tool for human liberation. For Werther and his colleagues, reason was a proprietary class asset, possessed only by the educated white elite, and used solely to construct justifications for their economic system. They corrupted the concept of reason, turning a liberating tool into an instrument of intellectual incarceration. Take the word the science. Science is the systematic pursuit of knowledge through observation and testing. For Dr. Pettigrew, science became the practice of selectively measuring skulls to generate predetermined, self-serving ratios. It was a methodology of exclusion, dressed up in the lab coat of objectivity. Science, the ultimate tool for discovering truth, was hijacked to manufacture a lie. And finally, the word hierarchy. In a just context, a hierarchy might be based on earned merit or demonstrated virtue. In Charleston, hierarchy became a static, racialized, and permanent structure based on stolen labor. They took a concept that could imply earned progress and twisted it into an iron law of immobility. Daniel's counterattack was an act of linguistic decorruption. He used their own corrupted language against them, forcing them to confront the original, pure meaning of their terms. When he used Plato's concept of innate knowledge, he was reasserting the original, universal meaning of a reason over their narrow, corrupted definition. His questions acted as a semantic shockwave, forcing their language to tell the truth. Your journey into self-mastery requires a radical act of linguistic hygiene. You must treat every high-level word used by the media, the political establishment, or the academy, words like justice, equality, freedom, progress, not as immutable truths, but as potential instruments of manipulation. You must ask, what is the original, uncorrupted meaning of this word, and how is the institution that uses it profiting from its current, diluted definition? The elite fear the man who can trace their language back to its original source of truth. They fear the man who can strip away their sophisticated layers of philosophical corruption and reveal that their entire defense rests on a few simple, self-interested lies. Daniel King proved that the true intellectual battle is a battle over the definition of terms. Win the terms, and you begin to dismantle the entire psychological control system. Word count check for section 23, the spoken text above is approximately 400 words. The descent now takes us into the psychological terrain of the academics themselves, the sheer, emotional cost of administering the institutional lie. These were men of letters, men who claimed to serve truth, and yet they actively conspired to execute a truth and erase a genius. Their subsequent lives would be lived under the shadow of Daniel's unanswerable questions. This is the dark, hidden price of institutional manipulation, the moral and intellectual corrosion of the manipulators themselves. They had to perpetually live a double life. In public, they were the esteemed guardians of truth and reason, publishing papers and lecturing students. In private, they were co-conspirators, haunted by the knowledge that their entire life's work was a defense of a fragile, lucrative lie. Think of Professor Worth. Every time he taught the Meno, every time he praised Plato's genius, he had to suppress the terrifying memory of Daniel standing in his library, using the same text to logically negate Werther's own moral framework. His certainty was shattered. His authority became a performance. His lectures were not about the pursuit of truth, they were about the maintenance of the lie. This internal conflict is the ultimate weakness of all command-based systems. The men at the top, who enforce the lie, are often the ones most deeply corrupted by it. They trade their integrity for power, and they spend the rest of their lives desperately defending the transaction. They become intellectually brittle, incapable of honest self-reflection, because one honest thought would trigger the total collapse of their self-conception. For the man seeking self-mastery, this is a profound lesson in internal sovereignty. Daniel, despite his physical bondage, was the one who was internally free. His mind was pure, uncompromised by the need to rationalize a comfortable evil. The academics, despite their physical freedom and wealth, were intellectual slaves to the lie they administered. Their comfort was the chain. Their degrees were the walls of their intellectual prison. You must understand that the men who enforce the limits on your life are often more enslaved than you are. They are trapped by their own success, their own credentials, and their own investment in a bankrupt narrative. Their power is conditional, fragile, and utterly dependent on your continued acceptance of their false certainty. This realization gives you an immense, commanding advantage. The clarity of your vision is a non-negotiable asset. The truth you pursue is not just for your own liberation, it is an existential threat to the comfort of the entire power structure. Your intellectual freedom is their intellectual cage. The enduring corruption demonstrated in 1844 was rooted in the elite's weaponization of fear. They understood that fear is the most effective tool for controlling consciousness and suppressing truth. The elite used two primary forms of fear. First, the fear of economic ruin. The entire system was built on the profitability of stolen labor. Daniel's questions, if allowed to stand, would have led to a collapse of the economic model. This fear, the fear of losing their comfort, their status, their capital, was what drove the academics to their conspiracy. It was a rational, self-interested fear of material loss. Second, and more importantly, they weaponized the fear of intellectual contradiction. This is a specific fear of the highly educated, a fear that their carefully constructed worldview will be revealed as fundamentally false. The moment Daniel successfully posed his wave-particle synthesis, he triggered this deep-seated fear. He forced the academics to confront a logical truth they could not disprove, but also could not accept. The response, erasure, was not a response to a physical threat, it was a desperate, panicked act to escape the psychological pain of being intellectually defeated by a man they classified as subhuman. The institutional manipulation of reality in the modern era relies on the same two fears. The fear of economic ruin keeps people locked into soul-crushing careers, afraid to pursue their true capacity for fear of losing the perceived stability. The fear of intellectual contradiction keeps people locked into comfortable narratives, political, social, and scientific, afraid to pursue the primary sources, the data, and the logic that would destabilize their accepted worldview. The man who achieves self-mastery must become utterly fearless of contradiction. You must actively seek out the data, the philosophical idea, or the historical event that contradicts your most comfortable and cherished beliefs. This is the only way to ensure that your consciousness is not being managed by an external fear-based control system. Daniel King was fearless because he had nothing left to lose but his mind, and he had already claimed absolute sovereignty over that. His self-mastery was his shield. He used logic, not emotion, to confront the system. He understood that logic is the ultimate antidote to fear. When your conclusions are grounded in unassailable logic, you do not need to be loud or angry, you only need to be right. And the truth, once spoken with clarity, is what triggers the panic in the entire administrative structure. Your power comes from the fact that you, unlike the architects of the lie, are not afraid of the truth. Word count check for section 25. The spoken text above is approximately 400 words. Let us now turn to the chilling detail of suppressed history and its enduring impact. The complete erasure of Daniel King from the official records of the College of Charleston is a textbook example of how a power structure defends its legitimacy. It is not enough to win the battle, the institution must also win the narrative of the battle. The college had to maintain the historical illusion that its intellectual authority was never once challenged from within the ranks of the oppressed. If Daniel's story had survived, if a professor's notes had slipped out, confirming that a man classified as property had used Plato to dismantle the philosophical case for slavery, it would have forever tainted the institution's claim to academic integrity. Every future debate on moral philosophy, every paper on natural law, would be instantly compromised by the unanswerable question, but what about Daniel King? The suppression of history, therefore, is an act of future-proofing the lie. It ensures that the descendants of the oppressors inherit a clean, morally comfortable narrative, while the descendants of the oppressed inherit a history defined by an artificial sense of intellectual incapacity. This historical manipulation is the ultimate form of psychological warfare, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy of limitation. The forbidden history we are uncovering is not just about a man who lived and vanished, it is a live transmission of the operational methods used to manage your perception of reality today. Look at every major historical event that is still debated, still distorted, or still missing key evidence. You can be certain that the distortion serves the economic and moral comfort of an entrenched power elite. The historical lie is always constructed to justify the current allocation of power and resources. Your act of intellectual secession requires you to become your own radical historian. You must treat every accepted historical narrative as a potentially corrupted text, a story sealed with the minutes of a private, self-serving meeting. You must actively search for the Daniel Kings of every era, the anomalies, the self-taught geniuses, the unanswerable contradictions that the institutional narrative has systematically erased. This is the only way to reclaim your true heritage, not one of passive acceptance, but one of persistent, subterranean intellectual resistance. Your self-mastery is tied directly to your capacity to pierce the veil of suppressed history and to recognize that the genius of Daniel King is not a historical aberration, it is a recurring pattern of human potential that the system must perpetually fight to suppress. The key to your future is to understand the battles that were erased from the past. Word count check for section 26. The spoken text above is approximately 400 words. We delve deeper into the nature of psychological control systems and how they operate by managing the energy and attention of the masses. The College of Charleston, by focusing their scholarly might on the defense of the slave system, were engaged in a massive, coordinated misdirection. Their public intellectual life was a grand, elaborate theater of distraction. Debates on agricultural innovation, European philosophy, and classical languages were meant to give the impression of a vibrant, intellectual culture focused on the betterment of mankind. But this theater was a deliberate shield. It was designed to keep the most brilliant minds of the South focused on everything except the massive, self-evident moral and logical contradiction at their feet. They were masters of compartmentalization, forcing all intellectual energy into safe, permissible lanes of inquiry. This is the ultimate function of the psychological control system, to ensure that the intellectual energy of the population is consumed in non-essential arguments and focused on permissible areas of dissent. If you are arguing about a fringe political theory, a celebrity scandal, or the precise definition of a subcategory, you are not asking the single, integrated question that threatens the entire structure. The system encourages noise and complexity in the periphery to ensure silence and simplicity at the core. Daniel King was a man who refused the distraction. He didn't engage in the peripheral debates. He focused his intellectual energy on the core contradiction, the unbridgeable gap between the philosophy they claimed to revere and the brutal economic reality they maintained. His mastery of diverse subjects was not for show, it was to build a single, lethal, cross-disciplinary weapon. Your path to self-mastery requires you to embrace a posture of radical intellectual non-consumption. You must stop consuming the noise and the permissible distractions provided by the system. You must conserve your mental energy and focus it relentlessly on the core contradictions of your own life and the larger world. Identify the most profitable, most untouchable, and most self-justifying elements of the modern power structure, and then ask the unanswerable question that connects the philosophy, the economics, and the history into a single, devastating synthesis. The system will try to pull you into a million small debates. Daniel's story teaches you to maintain a singular, unwavering focus on the master problem. The true battle is not against a million small lies, but against the one foundational lie that makes all the others possible. This intellectual discipline is the difference between being a pawn in the system's game and becoming a silent, sovereign force operating outside its control. The dark truth of Daniel King's disappearance is that the institutional lie is always defended by institutional violence. The violence is not always a physical act, it is often the administrative, bureaucratic, and social execution of a concept or a person. The sealed minutes of the Board of Trustees meeting are the ultimate evidence of this clean, systemic violence. The academics, men of refinement, did not personally whip Daniel. They did something far more chilling, they used their administrative authority to declare his existence null and void. They signed the paperwork that made his intellectual capacity a historical impossibility. This is violence by erasure, the strategic destruction of a historical truth for the sake of institutional comfort. The ultimate control system operates through this administrative violence. It is the quiet, policy-driven application of force that maintains the hierarchy without the messy, visible trauma of a physical confrontation. You see this violence today in the financial systems that create debt traps, the legal systems that enforce mass incarceration on a specific class, and the educational systems that deliberately underfund communities to ensure a perpetual scarcity of opportunity. These are not failures of the system, they are the system's function. They are the modern equivalent of the sealed minutes. Daniel's story forces you to acknowledge that intellectual resistance is never a safe, purely academic pursuit. The moment your logic becomes a threat to the economic and moral foundation of the elite, the administrative violence will be triggered. Your intellectual freedom is not a right they grant, it is a sovereignty you must take and defend against a coordinated, administrative counterattack. The man who pursues self-mastery must therefore cultivate an extreme level of operational awareness. You must recognize the shift from philosophical debate to administrative violence. When the gatekeepers stop debating your logic and start debating your credentials, your funding, or your right to speak, you have triggered the administrative violence. The game has changed. The response must be strategic, protected, and focused on exposing the violence, not on re-engaging in the flawed debate. The lesson of the sealed minutes is clear: the most dangerous truths are the ones that require the highest levels of administrative authority to suppress. Your intellectual power is directly proportional to the level of institutional violence it triggers. Embrace that reality. It is the ultimate confirmation that your work is essential. Word count check for section 28. The spoken text above is approximately 400 words. We now confront the essential nature of suppressed truth in the context of personal identity. Daniel King was, by all external measures, a man of profound limitations. Yet, his identity was not defined by his external constraints, but by his internal, uncompromised sovereignty. His true identity was forged in the silence of the library, through the acquisition of forbidden knowledge. The system's manipulation seeks to impose an external identity on you, one based on your economic status, your professional title, or your demographic category. This external identity is what they can control, commodify, and ultimately annul. The Charleston academics were perfectly comfortable with Daniel's external identity as property. What terrified them was his self-generated, internal identity as a philosopher and a scientist. Daniel's act of self-mastery was the ultimate act of self-definition. He became a man who was non-negotiably intelligent, irrespective of what the colonel's ledger or the academic's treatise stated. His identity was built on the unassailable logic of Euclid and the pure abstraction of Plato, sources of truth that transcended the political and social reality of 1844. Your descent into forbidden knowledge must culminate in the same radical self-definition. You must shed the external identity that was manufactured for you by the control systems. You must define yourself by the highest, purest form of logic and capacity that you can achieve in the silence of your own mind. You must be willing to become a living contradiction to every label the external world has tried to affix to you. The man who achieves this level of internal sovereignty cannot be truly heard by the external world. When Daniel vanished, the only thing the academics could erase was the property listed in the ledger. They could not erase the fact that Professor Hworth had been intellectually defeated by a wave-particle synthesis posed by a man they owned. That truth lived on in Hworth's terror, in the sealed minutes, and in the quiet, coded history of the enslaved community. Your mastery is not defined by what you acquire, it is defined by what you become, a mind that is logically unassailable and internally free. This transformation is your ultimate, non-transferable asset. It is the truth that changes a man forever once he hears it. You are not a consumer of knowledge, you are a sovereign producer of truth. This is the final, irreversible realization. Word count check for section 29. The spoken text above is approximately 400 words. Let's address the final layer of control, the sophisticated use of elite knowledge as a form of social and economic gatekeeping. The College of Charleston was not just a place of learning, it was a refinery for the philosophical tools of power. The elite knowledge taught there, Latin, Greek, moral philosophy, advanced mathematics, was specifically designed to be complex and time-consuming, creating a natural barrier to entry. This complexity was the weapon that enforced the intellectual exclusivity. Daniel's genius was that he did not just acquire this elite knowledge, he de-weaponized it. He took the tools of the oppressor and turned them back against the oppressor. He used Plato, a cornerstone of Western power philosophy, to argue for the universal capacity of the mind, thereby dismantling the intellectual justification for the system Plato was often used to defend. This is the ultimate secret of self-mastery. You must learn to deconstruct the complexity of power. You must treat every complex system, legal, financial, or philosophical, not as an impenetrable barrier, but as a set of rules that were written by men, and therefore, can be mastered by men. The apparent difficulty is often not a measure of the knowledge's depth, but a measure of the gatekeeper's desire for exclusivity. You must stop fearing the language of the elite. Do not be intimidated by financial jargon, scientific complexity, or legal precedents. Treat the Black's Law Dictionary not as a wall, but as a code book. Treat advanced physics not as a separate reality, but as a purer form of logic. Daniel had no teacher, yet he mastered Euclid. He proved that the only prerequisite for elite knowledge is the will to concentrate. The institutions that govern your life want you to believe that the complex knowledge is too difficult for you, too niche, too far outside your lane. They want you to delegate your critical thinking to their credentialed experts. Daniel's story is the counter-mandate: never delegate your capacity to reason. The knowledge that frees you is almost always the knowledge that the current power structure has made complex, expensive, and intimidating. Your task is to relentlessly simplify. You must boil the complex systems down to their core logical contradiction. Find the single, self-serving axiom upon which the entire structure rests. Once you identify that axiom, the complexity, the jargon, the legalese, the philosophical noise, collapses, and you are left with the simple, devastating truth. That is the moment of de-weaponization. That is the key to Menno's lock. The final descent is into the concept of forbidden history as a command mechanism. Daniel's story is not just a forgotten tragedy, it is a perpetually active threat to the descendants of the Charleston academics and to every modern system built on intellectual exclusion. By silencing him, they issued a command to the future: do not be that intelligent. Do not be that original. Stay in your lane. The true purpose of historical suppression is to manage the aspirational potential of the future. The system must convince you that the highest levels of achievement are reserved for others, that they are a matter of birthright, not discipline. By erasing Daniel, they erased a powerful example of self-willed genius. They removed a blueprint for radical self-mastery from the available historical record. But now, you have heard the history. You have reclaimed the blueprint. The command mechanism has failed. Your awareness of Daniel's story is the intellectual equivalent of having the sealed minutes of the Board of Trustees in your hand. You now know that the limits placed on you are not natural, but administrative. This knowledge is dangerous because it eliminates your excuses. You can no longer claim ignorance of the true nature of power. You can no longer accept the false mercy of ignorance. You have seen the heights of intellectual achievement that can be reached in the most hostile of environments, with the fewest resources, through sheer, unyielding will. The man who hears this truth is changed forever because he now holds the ultimate moral and intellectual leverage over his own life. He knows that the system is fundamentally a lie, and that the only true path to sovereignty is through the relentless pursuit of clarity and self-generated truth. Your purpose shifts from seeking success within the system to achieving mastery outside of it. Your final act of self-mastery is to internalize this story as a mandate. Daniel King was the proof that the human mind, when uncompromised, is ungovernable. Your life is your own library. Your concentration is your professor. Your originality is your weapon. You must operate as if the College of Charleston's Board of Trustees is watching your output, and you must make your logic so unassailable that their only option is the same administrative panic that followed Daniel's wave-particle question. Word count check for section 31. The spoken text above is approximately 400 words. We arrive at the penultimate section, focused on the necessary internal shift, moving from a mentality of reaction to one of command. The system wants you to be reactive, to argue against their latest lie, to debate their latest distraction, to expend your energy fighting on their chosen ground. Daniel King did not react, he acted by posing an unanswerable question. He dictated the terms of the intellectual engagement. His command was subtle but absolute. He forced the academics to use their own philosophy and science to confront their own contradictions. He did not ask them to free him, he asked a question that proved they were not capable of holding their philosophical authority. This is the difference between a plea and a command. A plea is a request for external grace, a command is a non-negotiable assertion of internal sovereignty. For the man seeking self-mastery, you must stop reacting to the manufactured realities of the external world. Stop arguing with the media's narrative. Stop fighting the political theater. Instead, focus all your energy on generating your own commanding truth. Find your own wave-particle synthesis, the original, high-leverage insight that only you, operating outside their controlled intellectual environment, can generate. This command posture requires absolute discipline. You must cultivate a mind that is constantly synthesizing, constantly seeking the purest form of logic. You must treat every moment of silence not as a void to be filled by distraction, but as an opportunity for deep, synthetic thought. You must recognize that the most powerful thing you can do is generate original truth, because originality is the only thing the system cannot contain, categorize, or co-opt. The academics in Charleston had all the external resources, the libraries, the degrees, the money. Daniel had one thing they didn't: uncompromised intellectual originality. That single asset was what forced their administrative panic. That is the asset you must prioritize above all else. Do not seek to be a better consumer, seek to be an original producer of high-level thought. Your command is to live a life that is a perpetual, quiet contradiction to the system's claims. Let your disciplined thought, your unassailable logic, and your self-generated capacity be the sealed minutes that forever haunt the comfort of the gatekeepers. You do not need their recognition, their fear is your affirmation. This is the final step in the descent, the commitment to a life of quiet, relentless, intellectual command. Word count check for section 32. The spoken text above is approximately 400 words. The journey ends not with a conclusion, but with a beginning, the irreversible transformation of your own mind. Daniel King's dark history is now a part of your intellectual architecture, a testament to the supreme, untamable power of the sovereign human consciousness. The lesson of 1844 is the final, ultimate truth: the only chain that truly binds a man is his own intellectual compromise. You have seen the administrative violence of the elite, the calculated corruption of language, the weaponization of fear, and the sophisticated engineering of a false, limiting reality. You have understood that the greatest threat to a self-serving system is not a political act, but a perfectly logical, unanswerable question posed by a mind that has achieved self-mastery. The 6 academics and the board of trustees attempted to erase Daniel King, but they failed. They merely transferred his explosive truth from the historical record into the hands of those who are meant to find it, those men obsessed with secrets, self-mastery, and elite knowledge. That is you. Your final mandate is to carry Daniel's example forward, not as a moral tale, but as an operational principle. You must dedicate yourself to radical synthesis, connecting the knowledge disciplines they have separated. Linguistic hygiene, treating the language of power as a potentially corrupted code to be deciphered. Fearless contradiction, actively seeking the truth that destabilizes your most comfortable beliefs. Internal sovereignty, cultivating a mind so logically sound that it is immune to external control. You are now a part of the long, silent history of intellectual resistance. Your self-mastery is your weapon, your logic is your fortress, and your originality is the unanswerable question that forces the modern gatekeepers into administrative panic. You do not need to fight their battles, you need only to outthink them. The knowledge you sought was dangerous. Now that you possess it, your life is irrevocably changed. Go and build your own library in the silence. Find your own Menno's lock. The external world may attempt to define your limits, but your mind is sovereign, and the truth you seek is the only key to true freedom. The time for waiting is over. The time for command has begun.